Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz saxophonist and composer Paul Carlon. We caught up with him about his new 2024 CD, Blues for Vita, and a quality life lived in jazz. He grew up in rural central New York and started playing music in the 4th grade at school. Paul attempted to follow in the footsteps of his older string-playing siblings by taking cello lessons, but the vibrant timbre and mystery of the sax called to him. From there, his experience with music was a mixture of schooled and self-taught. After finishing a degree in English literature from Cornell University in 91. He moved to New York City and became a part of a thriving 90s straight-ahead jazz scene. He's got a great story.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've really dug Blues for Vita. Had it on the show. Really enjoy your work. So,
well, thank you.
You bet. Before we get into your latest album and what's going on, I want to know first and foremost, 4 years ago, this pandemic kind of turned everybody around and upside down. How did you make it through that time period as an artist, and how did it affect this project or the way that you do things now?
Yeah, good question. I have a young daughter, so going through that with a young child was sort of another experience as well, which affected, I think, if you had children during that time, of course, your stress level was, especially at the beginning, was like, oh my God, and just dealing with your kids being home and not in school, or in our case, we did start dealing with a learning pod. So a lot of my time was that, when I saw these things about people putting all these albums, I was like, yeah, I guess you don't have kids. But in spite of that, there was a lot of time, of course, as everyone had, and I spent a fair amount of time both composing and practicing when I could. There's one group that I play with called the McCarran Brothers, and we started having weekly rehearsals through an online platform called, now it just escaped my memory. But basically rehearsing live, by using a pretty decent audio setup and something that could deal with, the time delays really weren't bad. And that kind of helped keep me sane, just having that little thing going. Besides that, that sort of changed how I do things in a way. I would say that, and I also got deeply into Pro Tools during the pandemic. Before that, I hadn't done a lot of remote recording. I was kind of behind the curve with that, I would say. As with a lot of musicians, during that time, I got, of course, much more into it and also enjoying it. I teach at a music production department at Mercy University, formerly Mercy College, here in Westchester County, in just north of New York City. And so, learning that software has allowed me to definitely kind of come farther to where the students are when they come in to the program. I teach music theory, and I teach two courses in music history, jazz history, and history of Latin music. So, that sort of changed in a way how I do things. I started doing also just demos at home for different projects. I would say particularly for this band, Nation Beat I'm in, which is a brass band that combines Brazilian and New Orleans influences. And I do all the, essentially the arranging and probably half of the composing for the group. And so during that time, we were developing material. I was developing material with the band's leader, Scott Kettner. And so I would do these demos of myself playing all the saxes to kind of mimic the sousaphone, the trombone, the trumpet and tenor saxophone parts. And so we would bounce these things back and forth. In terms of like this album, Blues for Vita, there's 2 songs on there that are pandemic songs. One's called Unmute. They're both kind of comments on all the time we all spent on Zoom. One's called Unmute, and sort of watching my young daughter learn how to mute and unmute to do classes at school, and just just kind of watching the pretty simple mastery, but also kind of profound, that the world circumstances forced on everyone, that these young children were compelled to master these skills. And the other song is called Zooming into the Void, which is just the thought during that time that we're all just zooming into this void that we don't know what the future is.
So talk to me a little bit about Blues for Vita. What are you hoping the listener gets from this album?
What am I hoping the listener gets from this album? The album was made really from the love of, it's probably fairly obvious, the love of the kind of classic tenor and trumpet lineup, Art Blakey style, Horace Silver, even some of Woody Shaw's stuff. I just hope, I think as with all my music, I hope they can find something in it that they like, that hopefully will reflect something that either they feel or perhaps is similar to something they've heard before, although I wouldn't say I'm trying to recreate anything, but, we do, as listeners, tend to respond to things, to music, sometimes according to what we've heard before. I think that depends on your level of involvement in a way. Musicians are trained to hear sort of more actively, and so, hear things that, to hear in our own heads, in other words. So that is not always hearing things that we've heard before, hopefully, at least if we're trying to do something new. But yeah, I hope they like it.
Yeah, for sure. So take me back to the beginnings of your life in New York and how, music and more specifically jazz evolved into who you are today.
Right. So I moved to New York City in 1991. I was 22 years old. I just finished an English degree at Cornell University. And I couldn't wait to get to New York. I just wanted to get to New York. And really the reason I wanted to get to New York was to be around the jazz tradition, be around really older musicians. And so I dabbled a little bit, and I came here and did one semester, actually in a master's program at Manhattan School of Music, which honestly at that point I was surprised I even got in. And then I just thought, I sort of I was very opinionated, I would say, as a young person. I had strong ideas about how I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And really I just wanted to be learning by hanging out, and that's what I did. So within a couple of years, Smalls had opened. I ended up being a regular there for a while, maybe a good year and a half or so. And that had a very profound impact on my development. Just going to jam sessions, maybe 3-4 nights a week. And, I would go, the jam sessions there usually would start either midnight or 2 a.m. And I would often stay there until the very end. So there was more than one night that, we were there until the sun came up and beyond, which was a great thing to be a part of. I mean, I would say that I learned more during that period of time, that sort of intensive period of time, than probably any other period of my life. And I was fortunate to be there with musicians like James Hurt, was a good buddy of mine, Sherman Irby, who I always loved his playing, Greg Tardy, people like this. Neil Kane started hanging out down there. He came to town. He was playing with Elvin Jones. And, just to kind of be around those peers of mine, closer to my age group, and then older musicians like Frank Hewitt, Charles Davis, actually John Orr used to play there also, Bernard Wright, piano player, had a regular gig there, Jimmy Lovelace, we all just kind of, in some way, sort of idolized. He was legendary. And so that was really the beginning for me. After probably around that time, also, I started playing with the bass player, Phil Bowler, and his band. And, Phil was someone who'd played with lots and lots of really high-level musicians. And so he was a mentor also. And then by the end of the 90s, I started to get fairly heavily into Latin music and Latin jazz, and I started playing with the Cuban trombone player, Juan Pablo Torres, in his quintet. And that was very formative for me also.
So what was the first live show you saw? First live jazz show that blew you away and that made you think, maybe I want to do this someday. This should be my life.
You mean like anywhere?
Yeah, I mean,
New York.
anywhere, like a formative memory of an early live show.
Boy, that's a good question. First live show. Well, I grew up in the middle of in central, what's called central New York. You know, anything if you live in New York City, everything above New York is upstate. But I grew up outside of Syracuse, and I had a teacher in high school. His name was Joe Procopio. He passed actually as a result of COVID. He was you know, he was really getting up there. He's in his 80s, and he was you know, for me, he was a real mentor and an inspiration. And so I would say probably hearing him play, to be honest, because he was just a fantastic musician. He was an acolyte of Earl Bostic, and he had learned various of Earl Bostic techniques by following him around on the road. So learned from the master himself. And, you know, hearing Joe, I particularly remember I think I was in junior high, maybe I was in 9th or 10th grade. We took this trip to Delaware, sort of an exchange thing with a school down there. And Joe and his brother, Greg, who was an incredible guitar player, played a duet together and just blew everyone away. And I think that was certainly like, in a way, one of those moments. A lot of what my interaction with the music, until I got a little older, was through records. Because there was some jazz up there, obviously, in Syracuse, and I went to see a couple of things, but I didn't live in the city of Syracuse, so I wasn't around it as much. But I did see, like, for instance, the Basie Band when I was in high school. This would have been after Basie had passed away, but and that was also very inspiring. And then I saw, like, at that time, Chuck Mangione was sort of probably, when I was in junior high, would have been kind of his peak. And then, you know, a couple years later, I saw him sort of probably at the end of that period. And that was very inspiring to see musicians like Grant Geisman playing guitar with him and, you know, just the band that he had at that point.
So what's been kind of your key to longevity over these years? What is it that you like the best about being a professional musician?
Oof. What do I like the best about being a professional musician? These are good questions, Joe, I got to say.
Good.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to answer that in two parts. I think the key to longevity, honestly, for me, it's like I can't give up. You know, it's not that I haven't had down moments where I just thought, should I really keep going, you know, in moments. But I don't know who I would be without it. You know, and not that I couldn't reach some point in my life where I, you know, made some kind of change or pivot, but I think music is always going to be a part of it. So it's almost like just a dogged determination, you know, regardless of, you know, you sort of have to be a little bit almost in denial of reality, I think, because the world is telling you all these things and you have to, you know, you have your own image of maybe what you want to be and what you hopefully want to continue to be or evolve into. So that's part of it. But I would say the second part of the answer would be, what do I like the most about being a professional musician would be probably just being able to interact with and collaborate with such great musicians. And, you know, in a place like New York, and I don't, you know, New York is certainly not the only place in the world with great musicians. I think there's great musicians everywhere. So whatever your scene is, but one of the benefits of being in New York is you can go play a gig that's a brunch gig or something, and you're gonna play with musicians who are challenging you always, you know, to play better. And I'm sure that's true everywhere. It's just New York has a pretty large pool of musicians, and so you might walk onto a pretty low-key gig, and all of a sudden there's this person. Maybe you know who they are, and maybe you don't, but all of a sudden you're just like, whoa, okay, I got to up my game for this. You know, I love that about being a musician. And also the chance, I would say, to travel and not only see parts of the world, but meet other musicians from other cultures and learn from them and understand how do they do what they do. What's the story behind, you know, their music and their history. I was just in Recife, Brazil for a couple of weeks. Just got back about a week and a half ago. And Brazil I've been to actually many times. I speak fluent Portuguese. But I hadn't been there in a long time, and I had never been to this particular city. And so that was a real kick to just be around those musicians, even be around new instruments that I hadn't seen before. There's a Brazilian fiddle called the Rabeca. And we were lucky enough to collaborate with a masterful musician from there whose name is Maciel Salu. He's a singer and Rabequero, a Rabeca player. And so, those are really key experiences for me.
So, over the years, you've been around a lot of veterans and luminaries in the jazz world. What have you ultimately learned from the elders that you, in turn, have used to teach younger players, the youth that you get around?
Well, yeah, another great question. There's things that people tell you when you're young that you're trying to be, or you're trying to embody, and maybe you don't yet, or you do in the way that you can in that moment. Sometimes later on, you really understand what they mean. I remember one time, I used to hang out at Smalls a lot, and the trumpet player Tommy Turrentine was there a lot during that time, and he kind of schooled a lot of us, whether we wanted it or not. Tommy was always kind of very truthful, and I think one time I was playing. You have good nights and bad nights, especially when you're doing sessions like that, jam sessions, and those jam sessions were quite competitive. Roy Hargrove was down there a lot. Musicians on that level were there quite a bit, and so you always wanted to try and step up your game. And some nights you just didn't feel good about how you played. I think one night I was just kind of feeling down, like, whatever, I didn't play that well. Tommy sees, and I hadn't said anything to anyone. I was just feeling that way. And Tommy sees me and he goes, it's going to come out one way or the other. The truth is going to come out. And I was like, how did he know that about me? He must have just read whatever was on my face. But, it's very true. You can try and be this and try and be that and try and play like this person or that person, as I'm sure we all do at certain points in our creative lives. But the truth about how you feel and who you are really is going to come out. And if you're covering up that truth, just as in personal life, and it's not going to sound real, it's not going to sound like who you are. So, I think that's key. I think another thing is just trying to maintain just be a regular person. Check your own ego, understand that everyone's in the same boat. Like if you're on a tour, you don't feel good because you're tired, you're worn out or whatever, and you still got to show up and try and be, try and treat people the way that you would want to be treated, and just maintain that level of not only professionalism, but, humanity. And, so those are some key things I think I learned by being around great musicians. And then also just bringing it. Doesn't matter if you're tired, the audience doesn't care. You're there to hopefully give them something they didn't get in their regular day. Give them something to help them, maybe access something in their lives that they can find through music. So when you get there, you gotta be ready to play.
So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, students, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I see myself as a guy just trying to get through the day like anyone else. In this case, of course, I'm a musician. I'm a tenor saxophone player. I'm a composer. But, I always try and treat people with respect, whoever they are. And I think I'm a little bit old school probably in some of the ways I look at the world. I certainly grew up in a different time and place. And the world is, as we all know, changing quite a bit. I see a lot of promise in the current generation that I'm lucky enough to interact with at my teaching job, and I learn a lot from them.
Beautiful, Paul. This has been great, man. Thank you so much for taking a minute out to talk about the album, your life and music. It's been wonderful, man.
Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate it. I checked out some of your other interviews. I'm a fan now. I'm going to listen to your stuff more. I've been listening to interviews with famous people, and it's cool. Good work.
Right on, man. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and tuning into another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest minds and cats in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Paul for his time, energy, and story. If you want to hear more Neon Jazz interviews, you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.